Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Titi Lokwe Fakoya, and I'm here with Margarita Aswani and presenting the paper. Well, she's presenting, and I'm here because I'm supporting her to present the paper on women's leadership in 21st century, the enablers and the distractors. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what I will do is just say a few words about our panel and why we've decided to arrange it in the way it is today. So just a few words of introduction. My name is Laurelène Piron, and I'm a director at the Policy Practice. The Policy Practice is a company that specializes in political economy analysis. And we're sort of trying to promote this approach and change the way in which development assistance is provided. So it's always really based on a good understanding of the context, and we take into account dynamics to have programs that are better suited to the current realities of a country where it's operating. And hopefully, we're hoping to see more successes as a result. It's an approach that's been in place for the last sort of 10, 15 years or so. And what we've been trying to do for the last few years is we try to see whether this works or not. We've got this hypothesis that programs that operate in this way, that are proactively thinking and working politically, should lead to better results. And when I did a review about 5 years ago of DFID's portfolio over a 10-year period, we saw there was lots of good practices, but there were pockets of good practice. It wasn't a systematic use of this approach across programs. And what I was really concerned about is when we looked at the dimension of locally led programming, support to local leadership, the approaches were often quite weak. So the idea behind this panel was to really search for good practices and lessons that could be learned of both successes, how programs can be well designed and well supported, but also failures and challenges that people find in practice. We had an open call for papers, and it turned out that we have 3 papers presenting DFID programs in Africa who were explicitly trying to think and work politically. So we don't have a paper that proactively was trying to analyze why a program didn't work or what the factors were that made it fail. So we'll have sort of consistent themes about colleagues presenting their papers and their programs in Africa and trying to reflect as to what made it work well and why they were able to support leadership. And I suggest that in the Q&A session, we'll be able to critically reflect on what made it work or not. So we're going to start with a presentation on Uganda, on the social protection program in Uganda. Then we'll move on with a paper on women in leadership in Nigeria, and we'll conclude with a presentation on social accountability mechanisms in the local level program in Kenya. I'm hoping that we'll have time for questions after each paper, and then at the end, we'll be able to do a general question and answer session. So if I could ask my colleague Alex to bring onto the stage David, we'll be able to get started with the first presentation. David's an economist by training, and he's the Social Protection Policy and Advocacy Advisor in the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development in Uganda. And yesterday, David was able to join us in the workshop we had on influencing policy. And it was great to hear your practical advice for early career academics and colleagues from the Global South trying to influence policy. David, I'm going to now leave the stage to you. I'll be off stage, and you've got around 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions.
Hello, my name is David Lambert Tumwesije. I work with the Expanding Social Protection Program in Uganda, where I have been for the past 10 years. And so I'm really happy to share with you our experience in building leadership for social protection in Uganda over this period. I hope that you'll find these lessons insightful. So let's all go over to my slides. So the Expanding Social Protection Program is nested within the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. And basically, the Expanding Social Protection Program was designed by this ministry in collaboration with DFID and Irish Aid in 2009. The key messages I would like us to share today, and maybe for you to take home, is that in my experience, ESP program exhibits the optimum balance between building the technical leadership of any social protection program, but also the process of nurturing the political commitment, which is so important for sustaining the system. And this has actually been a result of a very thorough political economy analysis, which has enabled us to craft an effective strategy for influencing and building tangible political support and commitment within Uganda. Because at the beginning, there was a lot of resistance to social protection. And we were able to successfully do this through strategic partnerships with key government departments, civil society, and academia. And these partnerships were very critical because as a lean program management unit, we couldn't have achieved so much in terms of the analysis and knowledge management. But these partnerships have enabled us to elevate the profile of social protection in Uganda. Our development partners have really been very committed to the long term, and this has enabled them to allocate resources over a longer period of time so that we can invest in this capacity development and influencing. Certainly, we are not yet there. We could say we are at the end of the beginning because more work is needed to consolidate what we've achieved to date and to test the sustainability of this progress, in fact. So, expanding social protection program started in 2010 after cabinet approval, and its purpose actually was very clear: to embed a national social protection system through building government leadership and delivery capacity, development of policy, and the piloting of a senior citizens grant through the social assistance grant for empowerment program. And this was important for generating the evidence that's necessary to demonstrate impact and administrative feasibility, but also to prove as a reference point for our influencing work, which is at the core of the fourth objective of building commitment and investment in social protection. It is jointly funded by DFID and Irish Aid. So one of the key questions I was required to answer in this presentation is what makes the ESP program politically smart program? What explains our success at balancing the technocratic and political leadership development process? I would say that it's mainly because we have based all our strategies and plans on a comprehensive assessment of the context. So the socioeconomic context, the institutional context, and the political context have enabled us to develop the right responses and position the program as something that's responding to real problems. And in fact, in terms of the political context, that's why we developed a very specific and elaborate advocacy and influencing strategy to build awareness and deepen knowledge of social protection across the country, because at the beginning, there were lots of negative attitudes to social protection and resistance to social protection, especially in the Ministry of Finance. And so we've countered that by exposing policymakers and our advocates the evidence of this impact, and to have very clear calls to action in terms of rollout plan and what the fiscal implications of these plans of rolling out the senior citizens grant are. In the process, we've also leveraged partnerships with civil society, academia, and these technical departments that we seek to influence so that they can participate in the generation of this evidence and also dissemination of this evidence, particularly with academia. And as I said at the beginning, development partners' support has really been critical because they've not just given us the resources, they've actually been proactively involved in the advocacy for social protection. And so basically, we've all committed to a very clear long-term and shared vision and appreciated what it takes to embed a social protection system and invested in that. So the key highlights of the progress we've achieved are basically two. One, We've built government commitment and support for social protection, including politically. There's a lot of support within Parliament for the national rollout of the SAGE pilot. We have developed strong advocacy partnerships and champions within civil society. The Parliamentary Forum has been really critical to the success of this program in terms of rolling out nationally. And social protection is actually very prominent in the policy discourse now. In fact, I've spent the last 2 months working with government officials to develop a response for social protection during this pandemic and the lockdown that has ensued. We've therefore built a very strong foundation for the long-term social protection system through building government leadership and systems. And most importantly, government ownership has increased because as development partner funding reduces, government's share of financing has increased from 1.9 million in 2015 to 22.9 million pounds to date. We've also developed a draft vision and long-term strategy for social protection, which has actually been critical for informing our long-term plans in the National Development Plan. So we've really been successful. We've achieved strong progress, both technically and politically, in terms of building leadership for social protection in Uganda, and development partner support has been critical to this, not least because they've been, key for the knowledge transfer of social protection as a development paradigm, but also they provided the TA that has been required to build this support. But as I said, this is just the beginning. We are at the end of the beginning and more work is required to build political commitment to social protection and mainly to test the sustainability of the progress that we've achieved to date. And therefore, as a social protection advocate, I know that we will have to double our efforts if we are to achieve transformative change and increase social protection coverage in Uganda. So thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to hear more about the Expanding Social Protection Program, I encourage you to visit our website and so that you can see more information about how we've been able to achieve this. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Ask your question, Margarita.
Good morning. Hi, David. Of course, here's my question. I wanted to hear more about the role of gender in your advocacy and influencing strategy, specifically because I presume many of the beneficiaries in Uganda are women. So I wanted to know if you made a deliberate effort to focus on gender in your advocacy and influencing strategy. Thank you.
Great, Margarita, thank you. And I'm going to invite anyone else to come and ask David any questions so that we get a round of issues. I would love for you to explain a bit more about the political process, how you managed to really get this on top of the agenda and to get senior politicians interested in social protection. Do we have any other questions to David? Yes, we've got a raised hand from George. I'm going to bring you to on stage, George, so that you can ask your question. Or Alex, could you bring George to the stage so he can ask his question, please?
One of the challenges with social protection programs is that they're normally hijacked by politicians, and you find that sometimes the beneficiaries don't really benefit from the support that is intended. So how did you work around this and also build trust so that the beneficiaries could also trust the system?
Great. So you've got two big questions, David, around the gender dimension and also how did you work with politicians? Can you have a go at responding to those points?
Okay, let me go. So the politicians, actually, the work around the politician, as you had in the presentation, was preconceived because the political economy analysis at the beginning indicated that there was not a lot of support, actually, both politically and among the technocrats. And so the design of our fourth output in particular, the one about building awareness and political commitment to social protection, was designed to respond to that. And so right from the beginning, deliberately, the program was trying to enroll political leaders, starting within the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development itself. So we made sure every minister there participated in a study tour, either South Africa, Lesotho, Brazil, Mauritius. But also we deliberately took them to the field to visit the SAGE pilot so they can actually see the local evidence. So it was a combination of taking them to see the international evidence and deliberately actually asking them to speak to their peers in these countries. So whenever we organized a study tour, they had to speak to politicians. They spoke to politicians in Mauritius, including the president. They spoke to the Minister of Finance there. We did the same thing in Lesotho. I think there was also another study tour to Brazil, which exposed our political leaders to the Senate, key members of the Senate who are involved in social protection. So we deliberately directed our politicians and exposed them to the evidence, both international and locally. And in fact, a big example was in 2014, after we returned from a study tour in Mauritius, and one of our ministers who had sworn that he couldn't support social protection was with me after a field visit. And I asked him, what do you think? And he said, David, I'm so glad I came because I can actually see the potential of this program. So exposure was really important. The second point about the political influencing process was that whenever we organized study tours, they were managed study tours. We made sure that we had a very clear program of work, combining learning, but also a post-study tour evaluation of the lessons and action planning. And so one of the successful advocacy partnerships we built was with the Uganda Social Protection Platform. But in fact, the social protection, it's Uganda Forum on Social Protection, was actually formed as a direct result of a study tour to Lesotho. Because when we're doing the action planning, the politicians said, we need a body within Parliament that can help us to appropriate funding, because that's really critical. And so the politicians themselves decided the best way to advocate to their peers. And so they formed this forum, and they ensured that it was financed properly. One of the members of Parliament said, I want a secretariat, but I want a functional secretariat. And we listened to them and we gave them the resources they needed. There is no contest that the success we've achieved in Uganda was because of this political influencing work. Now, on to the question about whether we paid attention to gender. We did not deliberately pay attention to gender, but I think it'd be interesting to know that 60% of the beneficiaries of a senior citizens grant are women. It's a very specific, it's a categorical grant. You have to be an older person or not, and in the pilot it was 65 years and above, and 60 in some parts of the country. But that was the only criteria. There was another part of the pilot, a vulnerable family grant, which was discontinued in 2015, that tried to prioritize women, but only if, it was necessary. So we really did not women, but also I think I should say that Uganda has been a champion of women empowerment. So you can imagine that actually everything with gender embedded in it. The last issue is that after we developed a policy, 2 years ago, we developed a gender and equity strategy for social protection. That gender issues are main, and that social protection programs have guidance that can help them to embed all these gender issues in their delivery planning, but also implementation. Thank you.
Great, David. I'm glad you spoke more about the politics. I'm going to publish a question from a colleague of mine exploring this issue about some of the political dimension in the program. If anyone else has another question, I'm going to do the second round of questions for David. So this is a bit of a tricky, challenging question, but that's what you're here for. So my colleague Neil asks, you mentioned that development partners were proactively involved in advocacy for social protection. Is there a risk that this will be seen as a donor thing, and therefore that social protection will not survive if the funding is eventually withdrawn? What's your response to this?
That's a very, very important question. I actually have experienced that. So I think there's both upside and downside risk. I think that it was very important for development partners to be actively involved, because the technical officers there, especially defeat development advisors, were very critical in the formative stages of the program, basically to provide in-kind technical assistance, because nobody really understood and had as much exposure to social protection in Uganda. So it was important. The only way we tried to balance that out was to make sure that we were attributing the achievements of the program to the government officers. So when I went out to speak on a public television program, I wasn't speaking as an agent of DFID, which is funding the program, but actually speak as a government official. In fact, most people think I'm a government official in the public. It's only within the ministry that they see me as an external person. However, having said that, the people who understand the way the program works, especially in the Ministry of Finance and even within the Ministry of Gender, they know that, you know, I'm part of the fund manager. So sometimes, of course, there are incentives. We are very strict on, you know, the fiduciary risks and things like that. So sometimes it's been a bit of conflict because development partners can be very strict. And so that has sometimes been used to frame this as a development partner agenda. So when it's convenient, David will be seen as a development partner. But actually, my colleagues, if they need someone to speak about social protection, they will reach out to me. Now, in terms of the real risks that have materialized, I've been at a meeting during the COVID planning, the response planning, and colleagues in Ministry of Finance said, why is David in this meeting? I thought we want to discuss these things as government. Sometimes, again, as I said, when it's convenient, government officials will want, but also I think the social protection agenda, because there's a lot of opposition within the Ministry of Finance and development partners are quite influential. A lot use that to say, this is not a Ugandan agenda, this is a development partner agenda, they are trying to create dependency. And so, yes, that risk is there, but would Uganda have evolved a social protection system without support from development partners? I don't think so, because as far as I know, most of the evolving in Africa in particular has been strongly influenced by development partners. So out, and I think this is not the prevalent view, but yes, some people sometimes want to frame this as a development. Finally, I think this really doesn't matter. I think for me, what matters is that social protection is right now in the mainstream and everybody can see its value. So it doesn't matter whether you frame it as a development partner agenda or a government of Uganda agenda, everybody can see its value. And so I think that was a risk that was worth taking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for responding so honestly. And we'll come back to that theme, I think, with every presentation, because each time we're presenting a DFID program, and that's a challenge that I hope Neil will raise each time. But also I remember from your slides, you were showing how the government is actually increasing its spending on social protection. So there's some evidence of the government itself taking ownership of the agenda. Great. I'm going to now move on to Nigeria, but we'll have time at the end for a Q&A with all the presenters. And actually do a bit of comparisons. So now it's going to be Margarita Aswani, who's going to present the case study on women in leadership in Nigeria. Margarita is a Deputy National Program Manager for a program called Accountable, Responsive and Capable Government, which is a pillar of a wider program called the Partnership to Engage, Reform and Learn, which is basically DFID's largest governance program across Nigeria. And earlier on, we also met Titilope Fakoya, who works in the same project as a gender and social inclusion advisor. And together, Margarita and Titilope wrote the paper. And actually, when we do the Q&A, we'll bring your colleague on stage, Margarita. So I'm going to now let you do your presentation, and I'll come back on stage later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can hear me okay?
Perfect. Very clear.
Great. If I can have the next slide, please. So I'm celebrating my 22nd anniversary of arrival in Nigeria. And when I came here 22 years ago, it was at a time when the potential for great political change was high. And there really wasn't the time or the space available to consider who was going to be involved in that change. So it took me nearly 2 decades to realize that we had a problem, that it was lonely and vulnerable at the top, and that we had both the appetite and the resources to address the problem. So the main topic of my presentation today is how DFID has enabled Nigerian women in top government roles to improve their performance. And I've cut it down into 3 parts. So part 1 identifies the problem. There just simply aren't enough women in top government roles in Nigeria. And the methodology that we took to address it. And part 2 will focus on how we were able to address the very important human condition of disconnect and vulnerability that female government officials feel when they're working, and how we could help them to perform better. The third part looked at how we were able to capitalize on available spaces to increase the number of women in government. Can I have the next slide, please? So you will see here on the graphs that women comprise less than 25% of top positions in Nigeria. The graph on the right shows that in the northern parts of the country, the women are even less, although significant steps have been taken for women's role in public life to improve, particularly in the south. In the north, we still suffer from lack of access, representation, and participation. Can I have the next slide, please? When we were designing the intervention, we asked ourselves 3 questions in Pearl. What barriers do women face? How can women overcome these barriers? And what changes were needed in both politics and in the workplace culture for men and women to work more effectively? And the barriers included access, both to informal and formal governance spaces, participation, this is meaning the ability to meaningfully contribute to decision-making. Performance, so I'm a woman, I'm in a job, how can I do that job well? And then promotion, how do women get access to higher positions, both within and across government? Next slide, please. This is our beautiful theory of change. It was very simple. If we put in the right inputs, which is technical assistance and strengthened skills, then we would produce the right outputs, which is an increase in the number of women who are empowered to influence change and have improved competence to deliver on their mandates. This would then lead to the right outcomes, which is improved capacity and processes within government agencies in Nigeria to address service delivery problems in a more equitable and accountable way. And over time, we hope that this would reduce poverty and increase growth, increase inclusive growth in Nigeria. And our methodology was also really, really simple. We did 3 things. We created a platform to deliver that technical assistance to selected women to address competency gaps. We created opportunities for peer learning and strategic networking. And we did this in a safe space that allowed the women to reflect on and to understand what are the barriers and the challenges that they faced and how we could navigate those challenges. That's what led to the creation of the Women in Governance Community of Practice. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So DFID played a very critical role in this process. By designing a flexible program, we were able to apply PDIA principles to develop the intervention. And we deployed political economy analysis to identify women change agents in the locations where we worked across Nigeria. And we used a number of tools to determine a few things: their commitment to reform, their connections to higher levels of government within their state and to the federal government, their level of influence within these structures, and whether or not they could become leveraged. And then once we identified these women, we worked jointly with them to assess performance barriers, and we designed tailored technical assistance that would most suit their needs. For example, in some locations, we deployed human resources for health experts. In other locations, public administration experts or public financial management experts, or sometimes a combination of those. But I have a story within a story here. At that time, the DFID senior responsible owner for our program, Pearl, was a woman, as was the head of DFID Nigeria. A number of their regional coordinators in the field were women. The Deputy High Commissioner for the North and the Deputy High Commissioner for the South were also women. And eventually, the High Commissioner in Nigeria, and she's still here today, was a woman. So these women attended our meetings, attended our face-to-face events. They promoted this intervention when they were out for field visits, and they encouraged women in the field to reach out to us, to seek out technical assistance, and to join our community of practice. So thank you, DFID. Can I have the next slide, please? So through this community of practice, we were able to address the disconnect and the vulnerability that women in top government roles face by providing capacity strengthening in technical areas, but also we believe that leadership can be learned and nurtured. So the initial trainings focused on applied leadership and managerial effectiveness skills, and they included lessons around understanding emotional intelligence, while we built communication and team building foundations amongst the group. Conflict management and an understanding of the gender biases that women face in the workplace were also explored. And we did this in the type of training that is not normally offered to government officials in Nigeria, let alone women who are actually having less access to trainings. These trainings were delivered in a safe environment. And this was important because it encouraged candid conversations about specific leadership challenges that women faced, irrespective of where they come from, what country they work in, what agency or what state in Nigeria. And over the years, tools and resources have been developed to assist women to navigate these barriers in the workplace. So we had an opportunity to share the tools with the group. So what the COP has done has enabled a process of collective learning, facilitating joint activities and discussions where information could be shared and where relationships were built for the women to help each other to advance in their work. In addition, a virtual platform called the Kaizen Group was formed, and this enabled the women to stay in touch outside of the face-to-face meetings. That platform is still very active today. Can I have the next slide, please? Finally, what the program did is we capitalized on available spaces. Let me tell you a short story about Kaduna State in northern Nigeria. In 2015, Governor El-Rufai appointed just a handful of women in top government positions and in his cabinet. And as he began to appoint women, we began to provide support. Now, this was more than what was happening in other parts of the north. And when we began to provide support, we also provided support to the woman that you see in the top left corner in the red shawl, Dr. Hadiza Balarabe. At that time, she was the head of the State Primary Healthcare Development Agency. And we supported her to reorganize the structure of her agency. And then we trained her and her teams. And we were able to give her some additional exposure to perform better. So when Governor El-Rufai was picking a running mate in 2018, ahead of the 2019 election, he chose Dr. Hadiza against all political advice by his colleagues in Nigeria, because this had never happened before in the North. There was never a female running mate. And when he won, 6 out of the 14 available cabinet seats were given to women, proving our assumption that equity and inclusion go hand in hand. And when you can improve women's performance, more women will be appointed to key positions. Now, Dr. Hadiza became very important this year in March and April because the governor fell ill due to COVID. And she ran the state for those 2 months. And who better to run your state than a doctor in the middle of a pandemic, and an empowered woman at that. Today, our community of practice has grown from 15 women in government to 52. I don't have time to share with you all of our successes, but I encourage you to download the paper and take a look and read about some more. Through the COP, we've been able to, it continues, but we are now having to shift gears because our program is supposed to be rounding up. And we are supporting the devolution of the community of practice to the regional level. So the women in the bottom left side of the screen are the women in governance, Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa states community of practice. They work in the most conflict affected part of the country. And just yesterday, they held a seminar on equity in planning and budgeting, while the women in the Southwest are focusing on improving and introducing sexual harassment policies in their states. Can I have the next slide, please? It wasn't as smooth as I've made it sound. We did have some challenges along the way. And the most difficult aspect was to gain acceptance to provide soft skills in a program such as ours, which was very technical. Secondly, we had to balance the investment of attempting to support a few reforms with women that maybe could possibly be removed from their positions or moving on or retiring, or we could invest in mid-level managers. And finally, increasingly successful women, like men, become increasingly inaccessible. So the risk of loss of momentum was higher as women became busier. But the community of practice still runs today, whether or not women are still serving in office, and that women continue to support each other. But what we have been able to prove is our theory of change, that equity and inclusion and improved performance drive more equity and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Hi, Margarita. Thank you very much for that. Laura Len is meant to be coming back on stage, but I presume she's having some technical issues. Here we go. I shall leave it back to it.
So, thank you, Alex. Can I ask Alex to bring on stage Titilope? And we're going to do some question and answer now. So please ask your questions in the chat box, in the question box, or raise your hand, and we'll have 1 or 2 rounds of questions to Titilope and Margarita about this issue of how you support gender. Hi, Neil. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, hi, Margarita, and hi, Titilope. Thank you for a lovely presentation, a very nice paper.
Okay, Neil's disappeared, but I'm going to publish this question. I don't know what's happening today, but I'm going to be able to publish Neil's question, which is that one of the assumptions of the theory of change is that government is committed to reform. So as usual, Neil asks an easy question: is government really committed to reform? Over to you.
Titi, can I go first?
Yes.
We didn't work with every woman in government. So Neil, if you're asking me if government in Nigeria is committed to reform, certainly there are elements and evidence that yes, there, like everywhere else, there are people who are committed to reform. But is every woman in government committed to reform, Titi? I think not. We chose not to work with every woman just because she was a woman, even where she occupied positions that we would normally have worked with, whether she was male or female. Titi, do you want to answer about the commitment to reform?
Only addition would be that commitment to reform, of course, is along a spectrum. So as Margarita has said, there are varying commitments to reform. And then there'll be state government that the governor in that particular point in time is committed to reform, and so will back up many initiatives with some political will. And that is what we saw happen in the state of Kaduna State. So yes, governments in plural, are committed to reform in Nigeria, and then the entire government has the entire federal government as well, to varying degrees. That would be my answer.
And Neil, we've got tools. So we actually, because we are very technical people and because we use political economy, we've actually, along with one of Laura Helen's colleagues, Gareth, we have developed an actual tool that measures just how committed government officials are to reform. So if you reach out to us, or I can pass all this information on to you, we're very happy to share this with other programs who are working in governance.
Okay. Neil, over to you. Did you want to add anything, Neil? That's fine.
No,
Okay.
I think it's fascinating. Am I allowed to follow up, or have you got
go for it. And then we have 2 other questions coming.
I mean, no, that's fascinating, and I think it's a very smart strategy as well. Can I ask the question which I asked David, which was about the donor involvement? Of course, the DFID engagement in this has been huge. The Pearl program is enormous. The ARC program is pretty big. You guys have done an extraordinary job over the years. As you may have noticed, there have been a few little political changes in the UK aid scene over the last few days. If, I mean, we hope it doesn't happen, but if, for example, the funding was reduced in this kind of area, are there domestic constituencies that should pick up this agenda and run with it?
I'm really happy that you asked that. Actually, when David got that question, I was messaging Titi saying, gosh, I hope we get the same question. So what happened? So I know it does appear that this is donor driven, but a little bit different to what they did in Uganda. We deliberately set out to use part of the money in the Pearl program to train women and to work with women in civil society. So we did that because we felt that the British government had spent a lot of money over nearly 2 decades training men in Nigeria, not because they didn't want to train women, but because the women weren't occupying the positions that where, a lot of the development partners are working. Here's what we've done from a sustainability perspective. The community of practice, this devolution from the center away from us is deliberate to address exactly this challenge. So the women in governance in Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa, they have, because they work in central planning ministries, budget and planning, they have allocated budget lines in their state annual budgets to support training more and more women within their administrations and the teams around them. So I think that's laudable. They've done the same thing in the Southwest. We used existing platforms to, one of them is called the Dawn Commission. They have an active women aspect, and Titi has been working with them to strengthen them, but they are allocating funds themselves. So if we are told to go home tomorrow, these women will carry on supporting each other and training, et cetera. Titi, do you want to talk a little bit more about the Southwest?
I think you've said it. The beauty of this is actually the fact that sustainability is built into these platforms. So Dawn Commission works with 10 states in the Southwest, and it's an existing independent platform. So they get their funding from all of these different states. So the Women in Governance program in the Southwest is linked with the Active Women's program of Dawn Commission, and they are taking over because, again, as we said, our program may come to an end at the end of this year, or is likely to, but then the Women in Governance will continue because they're not dependent on donor funding.
Great.
Fantastic. Thank you
very much. So Neil, I'm going to take you off stage. And we've got 2 other questions, one from Ollie and then one from Christina. So I'll ask Ollie and Christina to ask their questions, and then I'll ask you to respond to both questions together rather than one by one. So I'm bringing on stage now Christina, who will ask the first question. Oh no, this is Ollie, I think. And then Ollie, go ahead with your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I can't see where I published it anymore, so to read it exactly the same way. But basically to say, in case you've covered it, because I came in late, how different are the gender inclusion issues in public policy processes at an elite level, which I heard you speak about, and at grassroots level? Like, we have to think about these intersectionality issues, right? What other kind of barriers or what other kind of dynamics in the way that people participate?
Great. Thank you, Ollie. I'm going to now bring Christina on stage to ask her question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly, go ahead.
Super. Well, thanks very much for the excellent presentation, Margarita and Titi. And I know it's not always been an easy approach. It's sometimes been a struggle to convince, and let's face it, often convince men that this is a worthwhile initiative. So it's wonderful to see this has shaped up so so well and see all these great results. That's really a particular reflection of the hard work that's been going in there. So thank you for that. You've spoken, of course, we're all very, all on the same page that empowering women in governance in and of itself is a really critical goal and a really important one, and that we all want to support. But I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the what else, if you will. So what do we see in terms of the replication effect of women in governance? What do we see differences in terms of differences in allocations of budgets and delivering of services and the equitable nature of service delivery in those states where women are in those leadership roles and have been empowered partly through the program? Thanks.
And actually, we've got a third question. So wait before you respond. I'm going to be on stage Richard Holloway, who's another panelist, and then you'll be able to respond to all the three questions together. Over to you, Richard. Yes, go for it, Richard.
Right. When I was working in Myanmar, I was aware of, although I was not working in it, of something similar in Myanmar, but was dealing with much more local district level women's leadership. And I hope this is not trying to force cross-cultural exchanges here, but they kept on saying in Myanmar that the project would fail or would succeed according to the level of the acceptance of the women's husbands. Now, I'm sorry if this is very basic and very crude, but how important was it, particularly at the grassroots level, to get acceptance from women's husbands, or did it in fact not, was it not so important in Nigeria as it was in my experience in Myanmar?
Great. And then we're getting into a train there. I need to ask another question and then we'll stop there. But we've got Maya, who's going to come on stage to ask a question, if she doesn't mind, which was about the impact between formal training compared to peer relationships. And I think it's also a question I had for you, because I'm actually quite skeptical that training on its own works, but I liked how you combined it. So what was the balance of impact between formal training compared to peer relationships? And now we'll let you respond to those 4 questions.
Titi, do you prefer to take any of the answers? I'm happy to defer to you to start if you like.
I'm actually struggling with hearing at this point. So the written questions, let me take the last one first. The balance impact between the formal training compared to peer relationships. I would like to say it's a balance between both. So what we did for these women was we had a women's only training program. It's the International Women's Program, leadership program that's run by an institution called the African Women in Agric Research and Development. So they would come and, there was inputs, as I said, formal training, emotional intelligence, soft skills, team building, and all of the other things. That's formal training. In addition to the network, the Kaizen group that Margarita spoke about before, and that is just as effective in terms of peer relationships, WhatsApp, I've got this event, I've got this problem, I need support, how do I go about it? It's a balance between both. I think both are working very well.
Well, Margarita? I want to talk. Yeah, just so I will pick up from that aspect on the peer relationships. So men will go and play golf on the golf course and network and get jobs, right? Women don't have that opportunity here. So in one of the trainings, one of the women spoke up and said, I've been passed over for promotion for 12 years. And all the women in the room were like, what? And then one of the women said, well, I'm at the head of service level, and I'm going to call your head of service and say this isn't on. And within 4 months, Titi, the woman became accountant general. So yeah, so peer learning and peer networking is very important. It's a trick we're learning to replicate here in Nigeria. It was nice to hear Ollie's voice. I haven't seen him for a while. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the grassroots level. So because of the level that our program works, we work very much in center of government agencies at the state level and federal level. Ollie, we're very elitist, this, but it's not true. So So our community of practice actually includes a number of women, particularly from Southeast and Northern Nigeria, who are from civil society. And we actually invited them to the trainings when we were going to talk about mentoring. And this balance, our program is 3 pillars. We work with government. There's a whole pillar that works with civil society, and they have a women in governance component as well, where they're working within local structures that open up spaces for women in leadership. So there's a bit of a difference in the approach, but only because the stakeholders are different. I want to answer Richard's question about how important are gaining the men's acceptance in all of this. You can ask Titi's husband and my husband. They want to open a support group for the husbands of women who work in ARC because of the amount of work that we have to do. And what we found out, Dr. Hadiza, the deputy governor that I spoke about, her husband is an incredibly supportive man. And what we found out was a lot of the women in the room had reached those levels because they did have supporting partners. So our hats off, we recognize the men who are supporting these women to continue to work in these very difficult situations. Titi, we had a question from Christina. Hi, Christina, about what do we see that's different? Christina, I'm not sure if you attended our training yesterday. So the women, what we were able to do is prove our theory of change. Train more women will be visibly more useful and more effective, and more women will be appointed and promoted. And we've got evidence of that in Kano State government, Northern Nigeria. 1/3 of the women permanent secretaries are women, 11 out of 33. Why? They've been performing well. Now, what we have in the northeast of Nigeria is all of the women in the ministries are being appointed to very central budget and planning ministries. Adamawa State, Borno State, Yobe State. The permanent secretaries, for the most part, are women, and they're influencing budgets. We connected them to Southern Nigeria, where the head of the planning commission said, I've made my budget equitable. I'm including equitable indicators. Any ministry who brings a budget that doesn't have gender or equitable indicators, we're rejecting it. They've got to go back. We're introducing gender offices. So Christina, it's a little bit early for us in our intervention to measure the actual impact, but maybe if the program is extended, and we don't know now, but we could probably 2 years down the road measure it in actual monetary terms. I don't know if I've got did I answer?
Yeah, no, very good.
Sure.
Did you want to add anything?
No, I think she said it all. The fact that a state government is beginning to include equitable indicators in the budget, that is huge. We've seen other states done it. Borno State is about to do it now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the time that budgets are being realigned. So people are actually learning to put their money where their mouth is, as it were. And this is exciting for us in Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe states. So that's it.
Thank you very much to both of you for responding to so many questions. We're now going to move to Kenya to hear from George and Richard about a social accountability program. So I'm going to take you off the stage, and then you'll be coming back later for the general conclusion. So just a short word of introduction. George is a director of Vso in Kenya, and Richard is a close colleague with the policy practice, but also now retired. And yesterday you published a book, you launched your book at the DSA, you had a special session. Richard has more than 40 years of experience of grassroots development work. So on this note, I will ask Alex to upload your presentation and you'll be able to get started. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly, go for it.
Okay, as you can see, the title of the case study, Social Accountability Reverses the Usual Corrupt Local Government Leadership. We've been pretty bold in what we're saying we want to talk about. In Kenya, the government at the county level is responsible for the delivery of most public services to which the citizens are entitled in the Constitution, but it often fails to do this well or to do it equitably. So this case study shows how a project managed by the British NGO Voluntary Service Overseas, VSO, and supported by DFID through DAI's Deepening Democracy Program, engaged new citizen leadership in local good governance practices using social accountability tools and techniques, including political economy analysis. The sector that it directed itself towards, the sector that it reformed, was county government's provision of early childhood development education, and it increased the allocation of public funds for this in 2 Kenyan counties, Laikipia and Isiolo, both in the north of the country. VSO helped to create local citizens groups, community ward action groups, which elicited new leadership from men, women, youth, and PWDs, people with disabilities, in a previously passive citizenry. These new leaders were the ones who delivered the project. Next slide, please. Now, this slide is a visual one which showed the terrible nature of the facilities that were being provided by the county government in the field of early childhood development education. Citizens in these 2 northerly counties had very poor services in early childhood development education, even though the delivery of these was a county responsibility and they had made a budget for it. This is an important service that citizens locally wanted, to which they were entitled, but it was being largely ignored. And neither the citizens nor the local government were doing very much about it. In this situation, VSO identified local volunteers, trained them in social accountability techniques, got funds from DFID via DAI, and formed these bodies, which I mentioned previously, community action ward groups. Through these, previously passive members of the community were energized to research their rights and entitlements from county government, to demand better services, and make sure that the budgets were sufficient for the needs, but not just that, they were also spent correctly. Next slide, please. So who were these leaders, these people that we found in order to try and push to realize the citizens' entitlements? Well, the first ones were parents. Parents who were alarmed at the poor services that they had been, once they had been educated about their rights and entitlements, about the law and the budgets, they were alarmed at the poor services they had received. An early survey of the conditions on the ground, including the photograph which I showed you before, provided by VSO to citizens and other local government officials, forced county government officials to admit that they had not been doing their job. They realized that by improving these services, it could also be politically advantageous to them. Other leaders were ECDE teachers, or early childhood development teachers, which existed but were not being employed, or whose employment was on corrupt terms. And lastly, the public, particularly youth, who were energized by the results of the social accountability surveys. Next slide, please. So, if we said we were doing all of this work in the field of social accountability, what tools and practices were grooming an active citizenry to do the work that they needed to do? Well, the first one was political economy analysis, which is the common feature in all 3 of these presentations. This was carried out by politically smart researchers and announced in public to all stakeholders. That was the most important part about it. It was announced in public, including that picture of the toilets, which I showed you previously, which had people gasping with horror. The second was a scorecard, which is a community-level open forum to open up issues. It's a way in which people who supply services in early childhood education and people who receive services can talk to each other. The third was interface forums, formal county-level meetings, when the citizenry said, we have a problem, we'd like to hold the government accountable to this, please can we have a formal meeting for a high-level county government official. Then we had charters, formally agreed procedures, for agreed reforms, which we could then use to keep people responsible to what they had said. And finally, petitions, citizens-led requests, which is quite common in Kenya. In some of the countries in East Africa, if you write a petition, it's you're liable to get visited by the police. But in Kenya, citizens-led requests and petitions are quite an accepted tool for grooming an active citizenry. Okay, that's the end of my bit. I'd now like to pass on to George.
Thank you very much, Richard. So we have a picture there of members of the community action ward groups in Isiolo. So these groups were made up of diverse members of the community. It had women, it had young people, it had persons with disabilities, and they would meet regularly to have discussions around the challenges that we're facing in early childhood development education. As Richard had explained, this was an area that hadn't been prioritized by the county government, even though it was primarily their responsibility. So this group started now championing for change because they got the right tools that they could use now to talk with government and to institute kind of a revolution, in the sense that now the government was being pushed to the corner to acknowledge that they had not been providing good services around early childhood development education. What successes did the project achieve? We can move to the next slide for that, please. So there was increased county budgetary allocation for ECD, especially when you look at the infrastructure, the buildings, whether it was the classrooms or the toilets. There was more allocation, not just within the education department, but also the politicians had some funds that they were using for development of their wards. So they were able to now also move funds to support early childhood development education. There were also better terms for teachers within the early childhood development education. They had a scheme of service in the two counties where we worked, in Laikipia and also in Isiolo. And this was adopted from the National Scheme of Service for Teachers, which was supporting teachers, but from primary school level, from grade 1, but wasn't looking at the early childhood development bit. So when the national level was developed, we brought that scheme now at county level and worked with the officers so that they could customize it. And so that enabled stability for the teachers because there was a clear way of progression. Then the public also were really engaged. Young people and persons with disabilities especially really demonstrated deep interest in early childhood development education. Even though previously they were not really involved in it. It was one of those things that were left for women. And then increased government accountability, because the citizens now had the tools to track government expenditure, and they had also made a commitment with government through charters, which enhanced transparency. There was more interest in now seeing that monies allocated were being utilized effectively. There was also enhanced quality of teaching. It was interesting that when we were starting this, this was not necessarily an output that we were aiming to. We were more interested in learning outcomes for the learners. But it was interesting that quality of instruction also improved, especially when the government now brought in a new competency-based teaching curriculum. Then greater understanding around planning, budgeting, and progress tracking, especially inclusive budgeting, which initially hadn't been there. But now, with the training that we received around social accountability, and also with support that the communities now got, it was now clear that here they understood the processes of budget tracking and other elements. Also, issues that were important for the communities became now more apparent. And lastly, they were now able to use these social accountability tools outside the education space and look at other areas like health, in land, and other places. Next slide, please. So this shows the increase in expenditure. So we ran this project for about 18 months between 2017 and 2020. And you can see there the expenditure rising very significantly from 0.02 to 3%. And then also the number of early childhood development centers increased from 20 to 50 by this year. And this was having a feeding program within these centers. In Isiolo County, there was also increased direct budgetary allocation to health and also early childhood development education, where we had more than 200 million now being allocated. And this was a culmination of lobbying and pushing by the community, citizen, ward action groups. So it was very clear that our mode of work and the tools that we had presented and supported the communities to work with were making a difference. So you can see clearly there was a change coming from a classroom that was made of sticks and mud and just very basic, to a modern early childhood development center. Really shows that there was progress, and this was within 18 months in some of the areas that we worked in. Next slide, as I move towards the conclusion. So what was the role of VSO? So we provided staff who are very experienced, volunteers who are trained in social accountability. Richard Holloway gave us new tools of doing social accountability as he was supporting the project as an international volunteer. And we also identified a very highly qualified political economy analysis expert who really helped us to do a PEA across the project, maybe for 2 different times. And in fact, 3 times, because before we started, and then in the middle, and then after. And it was clear that there was change. The reality, the failures of the government, who are the power brokers, we were able to pick this very clearly and use the interventions in a way that enabled the citizens and the primary actors to really influence the government officials. And then there was also a learning platform that was created, which enabled the citizens to really now have more knowledge and insight, but also it spread the learnings to other civil society organizations. Next slide, please. As I wind up.
That's it, I think.
That's it?
I think so. Ah, sorry.
No, there was one about making a difference. Yeah, so politically smart approaches were used. We used a variety of social accountability tools. And we also really learned as we went along. So we really brought in the lessons that we picked from this project and put them into other aspects of work. And the community was now able to use this to demand for better service delivery around water, land services, registration, etc., and also health services. And then there was also a win-win nature because even though politicians were initially not very open to the idea, when they found that the community engagement meetings were helping them to focus and prioritize, they appreciated. And then for the government officials, they were happy because there was more budgets being allocated for them to manage. So really, there was a win-win situation in regards to this project. It made a difference within a very short period of time, and with a very small budget. It was maybe just about £380,000. It wasn't in the millions, but was able to deliver very quickly and rapidly. And we are happy that it can be sustained in the sense that the county governments did adopt a more inclusive approach towards budgeting, but also were able to use some of the policy documents that came out of this engagement for sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both Joel and Richard. It's hard when you've got 2 presenters and you've captured a lot of information. We'll do the same. We'll take sort of 2 rounds of questions. So if people want to start raising their hands or preparing questions, I've got one, and of course Neil has a question. My question is really around the role of VSO and how you were linked to the community. Because you said VSO trained people, but I'm not quite sure what was the longer term relationship you had with those 2 specific parts of Kenya. And also, I know that the project ended quite quickly. So there's this issue about sustainability. What is left now that VSO has gone? Or is VSO still able to support the process? Or is it all gone because you were not able to sustain it? So these are questions on my part, but I'm going to bring to stage, if they don't mind. I'm going to bring to the stage Neil to ask his question, and then we'll have Margarita asking a question.
Hi there, and thank you, both of you. It was a great presentation and a fascinating intervention. I had a question about political economy analysis, which you said was a key component of this. You mentioned that there was a local person who did this work 2 or 3 times. usually political economy analyses reveal who the key actors are, who the blockers are, who the advocates are, what their incentives are. This stuff can be quite sensitive.
Yeah.
And yet you said that you made it all public. How did you get people to talk to the researcher? How did the researcher get the person to talk to them when they knew that the results were going to be public? Quite often PEAs are very hidden and only for the funder. I'd love to know how you did that.
Great. Okay, so hold your responses, note this down,
Okay.
and I'm going to now bring to the stage Margarita, who's going to ask a question from her perspective. Go for it.
Thank you very much. So I'm seeing a common thread. All three programs have something to do with DAI, so yay. But we're about to start implementing an education program in Nigeria that has quite a similar angle on community development. So George and Richard, what do you think, in your opinion, were the most important tools, or the most important tool, and I'll be sending you emails to ask you for those later, that were used by your communities to demand for greater accountability? I think that's something that is really also picking up here in Nigeria. So the most important tool that you used. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so that was tricky. You've got 3 sets of questions. From me around sustainability and then VSO's relationship to the community. From Neil about how to use a PA consultant to make a public analysis and share that. And from Margarita about social accountability tools.
So I'll start with the ones around VSO and its relationship with the community. So in these 2 communities, we had been working in other programs, like in Laikipia, we had a different program that was looking at natural resource management and governance of natural resource management. So part of the communities that we worked with were not completely entirely new, but within the education space, we hadn't done anything around education, especially early childhood development education in both counties. So we were starting from scratch, identifying who are the key players, who are the individuals who held power. And so we did a political economy analysis in both communities. And from there, now we got to understand what would be the incentives that would be useful or meaningful. In terms of VSO's presence, we worked with community volunteers and national volunteers who are the facilitators for change within these communities. VSO works through a volunteering for development approach where we place volunteers to work with communities, but we also work with local facilitators who also volunteer to support the community networks and groups that we are engaging with. And it's interesting that we didn't have staff at some points because there were only 2 full-time staff who are supporting this project across the 2 counties. But then volunteers could go and have meetings with senior government officials because they felt very confident about the tools that they had and the approaches that had been used. In terms of sustainability, we also looked at the policy angle and ensuring that the work that we did got embedded within policy, like the teacher support, the schemes of service. We ensured that there was policy documents that could ensure that this remains for the period of time that the governments were in place. And then the community members also had this confidence because of the tools that they felt they could use. Maybe I can hand over to Richard also to maybe talk a bit about maybe what was the most effective, because being an insider, I may have felt, different, but he was also having that perspective of outsider, insider in.
I'd very much like to talk about the question of the most important tools, but I'd also like to talk about the sensitivity question that Neil raised. It was for me very fascinating to see that once people were bold enough to challenge government officials and say, hey, you have not done what you ought to have done, and we now know what you ought to have done because we've been helped by the PEA to understand what you ought to have done, government didn't fight back, so to speak. They accepted they had not done what they ought to have done. And there was therefore a space for people to talk to each other and a space for some resolution of these problems. I remember very distinctly in the big public meeting when those pictures of the toilets were shown and the audience gasped and the government officials blanched. And yet it led to a useful discussion. It didn't lead to people fighting each other or taking each other to prison. Moving on to the last question from Nigeria about what were the tools. Now, in the field that I've been working in of social accountability, there's 40 odd tools, and you've got enthusiastic proponents of many of them. I am a very strong proponent of two which link together to each other. The first is the community scorecard. And the community scorecard is very definitely a tool to be used at the community level. It identifies things which are not working between those who provide the services and those who receive the services. Do this in enough places and you get some common features. And if those common features are accepted by a large number of people in a number of different communities, then you have identified something which you can take up to the next level, which I've called public hearings or interface meetings, where you say to the government officials, particularly the leading government official, this would be the governor of the county, you say, we have had enough experience of doing these local level community scorecards. We know that the subject, for instance, of teacher absenteeism is a very, very important topic. We would like to address this to you. And you ask for a formal meeting. And the important part from the citizen's point of view is that you prepare very well before the meeting. You prepare your side very well to go into that meeting with a lot of evidence, and you work out who is going to speak, who is going to be most effective. And you make sure that if you get any response from the government, you note it, you make sure that they don't avoid that subject, that you get some commitment from them. And I move away from my Kenyan experience to my Nepal experience. What we used to do in Nepal was, as soon as we got some commitment from the government, we used to rush out to the local community radio service and broadcast it so that nobody could go back on it, because it had been heard not just by the people in the meeting, but by, let us say, 10,000 people who've been listening to the radio. You didn't have that opportunity quite so often in Kenya. But I would be very happy to have some more conversations with Nigeria about how to do this.
And maybe just to add something on the sustainability bit. After this project had wound up, we were still able to sign a memorandum of understanding with Isiolo County, which was very interesting, that it was an MOU around governance and accountability, and also covering education and youth and women and persons with disabilities empowerment. So there was value in what had been presented, and the government appreciated it, because they didn't back off when we had discussions around having a longer understanding. And now within the COVID period, we've still continued working even within the space of education, using community radios right now. So it's really advanced even post this particular project funding phase.
That's really strong what you're saying, that the work is continuing without donor funding. So you feel you've created some local processes. That's excellent. And we're now going to do a second round of questions. I'm going to, if she doesn't mind, I'm going to bring Christina on stage again, but also publish the question so everyone can see it properly.
Thanks very much, George and Richard. And it's great to see you again, and great to see these wonderful results reflected so well. And it's especially encouraging that even now, nearly, I think we're 6 months out of the program now, that so much stuff is still happening. And that's incredibly encouraging to see. So thank you for that. I'd like to drill a bit deeper in some of the approaches you both alluded to. I mean, you used quite a lot of these social accountability tools, but overall, I think you worked a little bit differently than maybe in a very traditional social accountability program, very much with different actors through collective action approaches, often more with government than maybe in a traditional advocacy program. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit on your lessons. How hard or difficult was that? How easy was it to bring other actors on board, and how did you manage that? Or what would be your lessons or wise words for other initiatives and programs? Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So hold your responses. We now have, it is great, we now have David from Uganda who's going to ask you a question.
I hope so too. No, I just wanted to compliment the wonderful work that has been done in Kenya. And also to say actually that it was quite powerful when we worked with civil society organizations, because it's important, I think, for linking the grassroots demand for services to the political level, In Uganda, of course, we weren't focusing on just the local government. We were promoting a national program. And so in 2012, we had a project to support the Uganda Social Protection Platform, which is a coalition of civil society organizations. And we leveraged their capabilities in action learning and coaching of, small community groups to develop petitions that were sent to local politicians, but also to Parliament. We sent petitions to the Speaker of Parliament, the Ministers of Finance, basically advocating for equitable rollout of the program. And the Parliamentary Forum was developing position papers. And then finally, we conducted exposure visits for different groups of local and influential politicians to visit the program in their neighboring districts. And they would come back truly energized to come and advocate for the program coming into their own community. So it's really, really important how, local civil society organizations can mobilize. And we found a very innovative way to link that to the national level. And so you can leverage the community level civil society organizations and get some really powerful political support out of that. So that was my comment, because I didn't get to talk about it a lot in my presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
That's good, David. And I like this idea of comparing programs. So any reactions from George, both to what David had said, but also the question that I'll publish again from Christina. Go for it, George.
Yeah, I think if you looked at our theory of change, we were looking at ultimately an enhanced responsive county government that really enables citizens to access quality services around education, especially early grade learning, which had been neglected. And so within that, we utilized different types of spaces. So some of it, we called it invited spaces. That was existing spaces that the government would provide because the policy or the laws directed that they must interact with citizens. But then there was also those other spaces that were invented during this programming, and the citizen ward action groups and having the citizens move from that low level to also sit within the technical working groups of the county governments was a new thing, something that hadn't worked like that before. So we used those spaces. And then we also tried to strengthen the voice of some of the groups that were not engaged in this matter. So that was persons with disabilities and young people who had little interest in early childhood development education. And then also looked at what would be the right accountability processes for the different places. So some of the interventions that we did in Laikipia was slightly different from what we did in Isiolo because of the context that were there. And then we prepared both the citizen side and also prepared the government side so that the government side could also be responsive to the citizens' demands. Because if the citizens understood these things and then the government officers didn't also have the same level of understanding or appreciation, then there could have been challenges. But I think, Richard also may have some experiences to share around this and maybe respond to the other question.
Sure. Lorelena, how much time have I got? We're getting towards the end, eh?
We're getting towards the end, so just wrap it if you could.
Okay. Well, I want to first of all respond to what's the difference between advocacy and social accountability. Advocacy is when you need to change the law, or you need to change practice, or you need to change policies because it's not working or people are being left out. Social accountability is when you have a law, you have a practice, you have a policy, and it's not working, but it's already there. So legally, you're on board. Legally, you cannot be faulted by anybody. You're just trying to make something which is already agreed work. Now, taking that to this example of Kenya and then referring to Uganda, if I might, in Kenya, which had a new constitution 13 years ago, very clear, all sorts of consultative mechanisms existed under the Kenyan constitution. And people knew that they existed and knew that they had the ability, if they wanted to sit in on budget meetings, to sit in on planning meetings. However, when we talk to people at the county level or at the ward level or the village level, they either did not know about this, or they had forgotten about this, or more obviously, they didn't believe that it would take place. And when I did the same kind of training that I did in Kenya, in Uganda, the response that I got from people when I said, well, what about your laws? What about your policies? What about the Constitution? The Constitution was about 30 years previously in Uganda, and many people said they'd forgotten all about it and didn't know what were the rights that they had under that Constitution. And as a result, they often said, no, there's no way that we could do that sort of thing any longer, because it would be seen as being combative, it would be seen as being confrontational, and we would be frightened of trying to do these sort of things. However, in Kenya, people were able to be persuaded that, yes, you have got these rights, and yes, it is possible for you to use these rights. I note that we worked at the sub-national level. We worked at the county government level. The remarks from Uganda about working at the national level, I would be very frightened of doing this kind of work at the national level, because it's much more confrontational, much more difficult. But if you can have a groundswell, a critical mass of different local government bodies which are persuaded of this, then you can build them up into a national level movement, I would say. I see you're smiling, so I suppose that you agree with me.
What I would like to do, thank you so much, Joel, Richard and David. We're getting to the last 5 minutes of the session, and I wanted to have a bit of interaction between the panelists and also some of the participants. For me, a theme that has come up throughout is how the programs were able to engage differently with politicians. David, you provided a really good example of how you actually supported them creating a platform and how you work with Parliament. I also want to pose a question for my colleague Neil, who's going to challenge you a bit about the Kenya example, which is it's a really clientelistic country. So local politicians don't always feel they have to respond to people's concerns. So I know you said, yes, people heard that things were bad and therefore politicians reacted, but that superficially seems to be too good to be true. Can you reflect a bit on whether there were other reasons why politicians felt they had to provide the services? And also, just one second. And also the same question to David, whether you can understand what motivated politicians to respond. And I'll also bring on stage afterwards Margarita and your colleague to reflect on that, exactly how you felt you were able to influence the politics in the sense of politicians. So Richard, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, don't forget the topic that we were talking about in this county, or these two counties, was early childhood development education. You can't be easily against that. We were not talking about land reform. We were not talking about much more troublesome topics. We were talking about something which it's apple pie, it's motherhood. It's everybody agrees with early childhood development education. And so it was not easy for people to say, no, I'm against that, or I have other things which are more important than that. So I think the choice of the topic helped us a great deal in the work that we did.
Great. George, any other insights?
Yeah, I think it was also something that was squarely a provision that the county government should be delivering, because the way education is divided in Kenya is that the national government is responsible for higher education and what you'd call basic education from grade 1 in primary up to secondary school. But early childhood development education and technical and vocational training sit with the county government. So it's a primary responsibility. But the challenge that was there then was that the county governments were not prioritizing ECD, but were using that money to do like scholarships and other things within the same education space, or constructing secondary school classrooms, which was not their mandate. So it was more of bringing them back to really focus on what was theirs. And when they realized that the citizens knew, then both the technocrats and also the politicians realized that now they were kind of cornered. So it made it easier for us to be able to move and realize our outcomes. And also kind of now tackle some of the issues around the resource mismanagement and where it was being placed.
So a bit of transparency. So I'm going to now ask David to reflect as well on this issue about how you were able to get engaged with politics and influence politicians. And while you respond, we're going to rotate our team from Kenya and replace you by our team from Nigeria. Thank you very much. So David, your reflections.
Right. Thanks. Yes, I think in Uganda, our strategy was to expose the politicians both locally and nationally to the evidence. So through the civil society platform, we were able to organize cross-district study visits of politicians from the districts where the program was not available to visit the program where it was and see the impacts And then in return, they would come and ask their members of parliament to advocate for this fantastic program. So it was exposure to evidence was very important. But secondly, whenever politicians went to visit the program, we organized a community meeting. So beneficiaries had a slot on the program to share their experiences and express their appreciation. So the politicians loved to hear the citizens attributing this wonderful program, for instance, to the president. And so because we framed it as a program that, the government was providing, and because it was significantly funded by donors at the beginning, but we gave the credit to the government. So people saw this as a government program, and so they were thanking the president for it. And so politicians are, very keen at picking messages like this. And in fact, all the members of parliament in Uganda right now acknowledge that if they do not deliver the national rollout of the senior citizens grant, it would have been very difficult for them to win again. And most of them who lost was because their opponents say these guys couldn't deliver the senior citizens grant. So the evidence from the program, plus the political, the implied political benefit from supporting it, were very important for building that politics.
Great, David. And similarities with Kenya, it was something that they had to be held to account for, and people demanded it, and it's changed incentives. Can I reflect?
Yeah, well, I don't know if in Uganda we really didn't try the rights approach, because we were quite sensitive about the political economy. Like, poverty wasn't a big issue for the government of Uganda. So we tried to frame it based on the political economy analysis around giving the benefit to the politician. The president wanted something that delivers votes, and this program is a vote winner for his party. So we framed it as such.
Exactly. No, you've said much better. It was a vote winner in Uganda, and in Kenya, for other reasons, they also felt it was a vote winner locally. Can I ask our colleagues from Nigeria to reflect? Because the gender issues are much harder, I think, to get top politicians interested. So if there was any tips. And then at the end, I'll bring my colleague Neil to reflect a bit more broadly on the stories he's heard. But just our colleagues from Nigeria, any reflections on how you got to touch politicians' incentives?
Titi, can I go first?
Please go ahead, Margarita.
I think the most important thing for us, building on what David has says, politicians like to win elections, and you win elections when you're showing good performance. So we didn't go around demanding for more women in governance. We worked with the grain. We worked with existing people and their teams in government. So let me give you a very real example. The current Minister of Finance is a woman for Nigeria. It's not an easy job in the middle of COVID, in the middle of an global economic crisis. We worked with her in the previous administration when she was Minister of State Budget and Planning, and helped her and her team to perform better, to the point where it was recognized and she was appointed as Minister of Finance in the second term of the governor, of the president. So what we did is we worked with the grain. We didn't go out there carrying placards saying, oh, we want more women, implement your gender policy. We found the women and the opportunities that they had and made those women stronger. Titi?
That's all. Yeah, I think that captures it. Thank you.
But I do want to talk about the role of development partners, if I may, a little bit, Laura Helen. So we had a case where a woman from the executive side, because our program in ARC, we work with government. We have a whole pillar who works with state houses of assembly and elected officials. So there was a woman who was making that transition across. And so we used the influence of donors who were delivering aid, actual humanitarian aid. So we had a woman who was attempting to get elected, and I think she was in the voting ground for 3 days. They were trying to throw her out. It's in a state where there's only been one other woman representing in the National Assembly at the at the Parliament. So what we did was we called DFID and we said, they're trying to throw her out. They're not letting her voters vote. She's being beaten up by the police. Call the governor, help us. This is one of our women. And they did. They called the governor and they said, shut it down, stop abusing this woman. So we used a little bit of influence where we could, but very quietly. But for the most part, we worked with the grain. We worked with the women who were there.
Great, thank you very much. I know we're over time, but we still have some participants. So if you don't mind, Titelope, I will take you off the stage, and I'm going to bring on stage my colleague Neil to share any reflections he has. Neil and I work very closely in terms of learning lessons on thinking and working politically. So I thought he might have some insights to share with us before we close the session. Neil, any reactions?
What a fascinating set of papers and presentations. I feel privileged to have heard them. I just did one reflection, which was across all three of the papers, you see the importance of what I would call invisible structures. So I'm an economist like David, right? And if I was thinking about social protection in Uganda, I'd say, well, it's easy, it's obvious. Here, I can show you some evidence. This is what works. But you didn't take the economistic approach. You said, well, hang on a minute, what's the politics behind this? Who's going to support it? And you went and you found out how the interests and the attitudes of the politicians are malleable. And you work through that in order to try and shift perceptions so that they now have bought into a program and they own this program. It's their program. Margarita, I loved your comment about golf clubs. You know, you've got a group of women. I live in Oxford. Oxford's all about clubs, all about old boys networks and so forth. And that is a network which help them all get ahead, okay? You've done the same brilliant job with Titelope and the team in creating that kind of network, that kind of tacit knowledge, that kind of tacit relationships that you need to be able to get ahead and build strength and so forth. And then finally, in the example of Kenya, what I found fascinating was here is a country that is very, very clientelistic in the way in which its politics operated. And yet the local politicians responded. Why did the local politicians respond? They probably didn't respond because they knew they needed to in order to be able to election. Maybe George and Rich will correct me. But one possible reason is maybe they responded because of the power of shame and the power of pride and respect from their local constituents. They didn't want to be shown up. They wanted to make sure that they were doing something which is suitable. And the choice of topic of mothers and babies, what could be better? You can't be against young children. So therefore, I thought all three of them show very powerfully the power of these invisible structures and how you can work with these invisible structures to really achieve something. Very, very nice papers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. And unfortunately, we're sort of way past the end of the session. So I would like to say a huge thank you to David, Margarita, Richard, and George, because you've been working tirelessly with me now for about a month, or more than a month, preparing the papers, recording the videos, and it was useful, David. We had to use your video, so I'm really grateful. We need to think now about next steps and what can we do with the three papers. You can contact, for those of you that are not part of our network, please feel free to email me with your thoughts, what you picked up from the session, any ideas that struck you. And I think we'll then reflect ourselves as well as a group to see what we do next with these different case studies, because as Neil said, they're all really insightful and all different. You all work differently to get the change you want to building different coalitions. And I'd also like to thank Alex, who's behind the stage, but she saved the day many times today and yesterday. So thank you so much, Alex, for your IT support and behind the scenes management of the situation, and also Sally, our volunteer, who helped resolve some of the technical challenges that we had. Thank you very much to everyone, and then please feel free to stay in touch with us and enjoy the last session of the DSA, I think, after the coffee break. Thank you very much.